EOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday. Welcome to this special bonus episode of Black Box Online Radio. On Thursdays, I've been releasing some bonus episodes about the Zodiac Killer, and I polled you guys and I asked, which Zodiac Killer suspect did you want to hear about? And you voted for Chester Clark Klingle. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Zodiac Killer. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Now, I would like to give a big thanks to everyone who listened to the most recent Zodiac Monday, where I interviewed Michael Cole, who is the author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, and I am proud to say that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show. And if the Zodiac case fascinates you, be sure to check out the Zodiac Revisited. It's a deep dive into the mystery with a unique and interesting perspective. The trilogy is available on Amazon, Spotify, and wherever you get your favorite true crime books. And if you enjoy the series, please consider helping out Michael by leaving a 5-star review. Okay, though, with the Zodiac mystery, we have several different sub-mysteries that have been incorporated into it. And firstly, the Zodiac was not only a serial killer, he also wrote letters, cryptograms, and greeting cards. And that's where we have to start with these discussions on Chester Klingle as a Zodiac suspect, because in 1990, an unconfirmed Zodiac communication was mailed from Eureka, California, that has since been labeled the Eureka card. It's also called the Snowman card, and it's one of the secret PAL cards. Some people think that this was an authentic communication, and other people believe that this is something that was just made up by a hoaxer or a prankster. What's different about the Eureka card is that it contained a Xerox copy of 2 mailbox keys, and they both had numbers on them, and they was ultimately traced back to Chester Clark Klingle Jr., also known as Chester Clark Klingle II. And the questions that we will be exploring in this episode are, was Chester Klingle the Zodiac Killer? Number 2, was he the person who fabricated the Eureka card? Because those two statements are not hand in hand. They are not synonymous. He could be the person who mailed the Eureka card, but not the Zodiac. And there's a third one, and that is, was Chester Clark Klingle the man who made the Tarbox confession? And the Tarbox confession comes to us from an individual named Robert Tarbox, who claimed that an individual walked into his law office, Tarbox was a lawyer, and he said that this person confessed to being the Zodiac Killer. He paid him $50 for a retainer fee, meaning that he wanted Robert Tarbox to represent him. He wanted to confess that he was the Zodiac Killer, and he had chosen Tarbox as his lawyer, and Tarbox never saw him again. But he did state that the man was a merchant marine, and Chester Clark Klingle was a former merchant marine. So all of these questions are going to be explored, and this is one where we are truly going to work backwards, because I'm going to go over to Chester Clark Klingle's obituary. And first, he was born in 1926. He was actually born on May 27th of that year, and my birthday is May 26th, so he was one day ahead of me. He has the Gemini thing going for him, so I'm sure he was a pretty cool dude, I kid thee not. However, if he was born in 1926, that would mean that he was 42 years old at the time of the first Zodiac crime in 1968, the Lake Herman Road murders. Then he would have been 43 years old during the majority of Zodiac Killer activity, which took place in 1969. 43 years old is not impossible for being the Zodiac Killer, because I cannot stress this enough. When you look at the Zodiac brought to life through AI, when they take the composite sketch of the Zodiac Killer and they bring it to life with AI, he looks like someone who's in his early 40s. Even before AI was messing around with the Zodiac Killer, when you just look at a colorized composite of the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, he looks like somebody who was in his early 40s, in my opinion. And also, Chester Clark Klingle does have some facial similarities to the composite sketch. But let's go through his obituary. Chester Clark Klingle Jr. was born on May 27th of 1926. He passed away on January 17th, 2017. He was born in San Francisco to Alice Marjorie Stewart and Chester Clark Klingle I. He grew up in Alameda, California. As a youth, he enjoyed playing in the Bay, raising pigeons, hopping trains, and selling peanuts at Stanford ball games. Okay, though, so this is another thing that is not exactly a strong point, but it's a mild point. I personally think that the Zodiac Killer grew up in California, especially Northern California. I don't see an enormous amount of evidence that the Zodiac would have grown up in a different state and then just moved to California perhaps in 1967 or 68, right before the murders. A lot of things seem to point to the Zodiac showing a very intense familiarity with the state of California. But it is an unsolved case. I suppose that anything is possible. At age 15, he lied about his age and joined the Merchant Marines. That's what I mentioned before. He sailed the South Pacific on the Matthew P. Diddy, a Liberty ship. He contracted tuberculosis and was in an asylum in Livermore, then went to Yosemite to recuperate. He was enlisted in the Army and trained at Fort Bliss, Texas, served on Guam, at the Hanford Plutonium Works in Washington, and San Francisco Presidio during radar repair. Well, of course, the case breakers like to bring up the similarities between the radar machines and the Zodiac Killer symbol. They both have that circle with the cross going through it. Radar machines would have that in the center, and maybe it hypnotically brainwashed someone into becoming the Zodiac Killer. I kid thee not. He worked for the American Aviation, developing oscilloscopes, and he farmed in the Amargosa Desert, then returned to San Francisco for the Fireman's Fund insurance. Chet's first wife, Yolanda, passed away in a car accident. His second wife was short, and that was to Blandina Sarkis, and they did add love, happiness, family, and great food to the life. He had many good years in the Tam Valley before beginning a farming venture near Turlock, California. Chet and Blandina bought nut orchards and developed a successful walnut and hulling and drying business. After Blandina passed away, the farming project lost appeal. Chet sold the farm and moved to Eureka, California, where he made friends. And he spent the last decade working on the winning sweepstakes and enjoying it says working on winning the sweepstakes and enjoying breakfast at a club. So that's the obituary from Chester Clark Klingle there. Now, some of that stuff you might think is going to be relevant to the Zodiac Killer mystery. Other things you might just kind of like glaze over. For example, military background. All right, fair enough. As well as somebody who moves to Eureka, California late in life. And I also have to give a shout out to Drew Beeson, the host of the Zodcast and author of the book Citing It on the Zodiac Killer. I also just watched his episode that he made on Chester Clark Klingle, and there is a lot of good information in there, and I'm really going to get into some of Drew's skepticism about Chester Klingle as a Zodiac suspect later on in the episode. But one thing that was brought up was that Chester Clark Klingle did not move to Eureka until late in his life. And if this card was mailed in 1990, and the exact number that I remember was 1993, when Chester Clark Klingle would have moved to Eureka, the exact year that I remember is 93, then why on earth would he have the post office box in Eureka, California? And we're going to explore that throughout the entire duration of the episode. I think, though, to just address this very clearly, why would somebody have a post office box in that town if it wasn't their primary residence? Point number one, maybe they owned a property there that also allowed them to have a post office box. And point number two, maybe they had a family member who lived there and they also had access to a post office box. And we're going to see with Chester Klingle that might actually be the more plausible option. But there's an article that was written about the Eureka card and Chester Klingle on ZodiacCiphers.com. There are two of them actually to explore. This is called Unlocking the Keys to Eureka. On March 3rd, 2007, Daniel King, the editorial assistant of the San Francisco Chronicle, unearthed the Eureka card among some photo files just after the release of the 2007 Fincher film. And I think that most of you who follow the Zodiac Killer mystery will have heard this before, but yes, the Eureka card was mailed in 1990, and for simplicity's sake, it was rediscovered in 2007, and Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com actually had a lot of input, and he was heavily involved with this investigation that would ultimately lead it back to Chester Clark Klingle. Now, the Eureka card says, From your secret pal. Can't guess who I am yet? Well, look inside and you'll find out. And once opened, it revealed that I'm gonna keep you guessing. Happy holidays anyway. This message was part of the original card, which had no additional writing from the sender. Within the card, there were 2 photocopied post office keys and a chain, each of which contained 5 punched and traceable numbers, 79408 and 58851. It was claimed that the post office keys were traced to their owner, Chester Clark Klingle, who lived in Eureka, California, in 1990 at the time of the communication. And like I said, though, we're going to get into some things about his whereabouts. According to the obituary of Chester Clark Klingle, it stated that since somewhere during his timeline that he did not move until after his wife had passed away on September 9th of 1993. Therefore, if the obituary is accurate, Chester Klingle moved to Eureka sometime after 1993 or September of 1993. So what was he doing with the post office box in Eureka if he didn't live there? So I think that this would definitely be leaning towards something about having a family member in the area, because The Foreigner, a contributor to the Zodiac Killer site forum, did point out that Chester Clark Klingle's daughter was living in Eureka at the time that the card was mailed. However, the claim that we have been led to believe for many years is correct, then Chester Klingle could have been living in Eureka in 1990 with his wife Blandina. It would not be unusual for her to be in Turlock, California, which is about a 700. Oh, it says it would be unusual for her to be in Turlock, which is a 740-mile round trip away. A lot of married couples do spend time in different parts of the country once they get older. Sometimes they even spend time in different countries if they have, certain backgrounds. It's not impossible for 2 people to be married and spending part of the year in one town and part of the year in another. And I'm not saying that that's my go-to theory. It's just I'm not overly shocked when I hear a story about how somebody might be spending part of the year in Eureka, California, and then someone's 335 miles away in Turlock, California. That really doesn't bother me at all, actually. What it seems like is much more certifiable is that Chester Klingle was he had connections to Eureka, California. The card was mailed from Eureka, California. The key was traced back to him. And some of you might notice this on Zodiac Monday. What I get accused of a lot is not taking strong stances on the issues. And, because it's an unsolved case, it's not like I can just tell you who the Zodiac Killer is, and I'm trying to be honest. And I certainly don't want to endorse a suspect if I'm really not very certain. But with the Eureka card, this is one that I had a very big reversal on. And in the past, if you go back and listen to some of the older episodes of BBOR, you might hear me saying that out of all of the unconfirmed communications, I would say that the Eureka card was most likely to have been from the actual Zodiac Killer. And the reasons for that would be, number one, I thought the handwriting was actually very similar, particularly the tilt to the side. Number two, the Secret Pal reference. The Zodiac also used the word Secret Pal on the Halloween card, mailed in 1970, 20 years before the Eureka card. And this fits in with the type of taunting and arrogance and trolling that the Zodiac Killer would have used. And also, the fact that the snowman in the card is wearing Groucho Marx sunglasses. And it's possible, I repeat, possible, that when the Zodiac Killer was quoting things from The Mikado by Gilbert and Sullivan, which he did in multiple letters, whether it's the Exorcist letter, the Little List letter, maybe even the Lake Berryessa stabbing that was committed by the Zodiac was a Mikado reference. Maybe. Now, that might be the Groucho Marx version of the Mikado. Some people will take that to the bank, and they will just say, that's their go-to. That's what they think happened. They think that the Zodiac was using the Groucho Marx version, and they have some of their reasons for that, like looking at the specific variants of the lyrics and so on. So all of that stuff, to me, indicated at the time that the Zodiac most likely wrote the Eureka card. However, and this is a very big however, I did have to take a step back from that, and as of now, I would think that the most likely communications to have actually come from the Zodiac Killer that are unconfirmed are the 1974 letters. We have the previously mentioned Exorcist letter in 1974 that talks about not only the Mikado, but also about watching The Exorcist and thinking that it's the best satirical comedy ever. And then there are 3 other letters that came in 1974. The SLA letter, the Badlands card, and the Count Marco letter, I would think that those were absolutely, absolutely higher in my book as to have actually come from the killer than the Eureka card. But to give a very strong stance, before I did this type of revising for this episode, I would have said that the Zodiac was, no, let's not even say Zodiac. I would have said that Chester Clark Klingle was 99% responsible for the Eureka card. But after doing the revising, I dropped it down to 95%, but that's still pretty high. That's more than 9 out of 10, like 95% that Chester Clark Klingle was responsible for the Eureka card. For all the reasons that I've mentioned, it was traced back to him. That's the biggest nutshell version. But what do you think? And this would also mean that I'm not overly convinced that Chester Klingle was the Zodiac Killer, though, and the fact that he has been publicly identified, put under the microscope, and they did not make an arrest, that does tell me something. Now, they might just not have the forensic evidence, that could be one thing, but I also am just very, very suspicious about how the investigation didn't turn into something more fruitful if he were indeed the killer. But there's a second article that was written about him on ZodiacCyphers.com. Big shout out to Richard Grinnell, who runs that website. He makes amazing things. And this is called The Mystery of the Keys. And this one says that it has been stated that one of the keys that was depicted in the Eureka card was traced to its owner, Chester Clark Klingle. And again, there are 2 keys, and I've already read off the numbers for you. The question has arisen, if the Eureka card was mailed by the Zodiac Killer, how did he acquire the post office box key of Chester Clark Klingle in order to photocopy it? If the Zodiac Killer didn't find the key and trace its owner, then the logical conclusion is that at some point Chester Clark Klingle may have crossed paths with him. After Chester was married to his second wife Blandina in 1965, they visited relatives in Turlock, California, before they purchased a property, 6413 Keys Road. Keys, what a wonderful word. They eventually sold the property and bought a 20-acre ranch from a walnut huller named Glenn DeLay in 1976. That is the only tenuous link that can be forged between Chester Clark Klingle and the Zodiac Killer, who, if we believe abducted Kathleen Johns on March 22, 1970, may have been traveling back to Vallejo. And this is, there's actually a diagram on Richard's website where he talks about how Kathleen Johns would have gone down Route 99, and this would have only been her driving path would have only been 1.66 miles from Chester Clark Klingle's property. And Kathleen Johns was the woman who survived a possible abduction from the Zodiac Killer on March 22nd of 1970, and if you think that that was genuine Zodiac activity. So, here is something, though, that I do want to talk about, because I told you I would come back to Drew Beeson's statements about the Zodiac and the Eureka card. Challenge number 1. Maybe, just maybe, Chester Klingle was not the source of the Xerox. And I told you, I'm 95% certain, but this is a hypothetical. Maybe he wasn't the source of the Xerox. Maybe the Zodiac Killer found a pair of keys that he lost, and he photocopied them because he's like, alright, I'm gonna photocopy this, it's a red herring. I mean, how incriminating would that be? Sending in the red herring, you're just sending people on a wild goose chase, which it seems like the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s and 70s would like to do. Alright, that could be one possibility. And the second possibility would be that Chester did cross paths with the Zodiac, and the Zodiac took the keys from him. That's something that's mentioned in Richard's article there. You guys can weigh in the comment section about what you think is most likely to have happened. And to give some other possibilities about why Chester could be the source of the keys as opposed to the Zodiac, and them being different people, this is something else in a different direction. Richard Grinnell was the first person to post this online that I found. I mean, I learned about it from him. That the person who invented the photocopier was named Chester Carlson. Chester Klingle, Chester Carlson. Now, would somebody like Chester Klingle have known that and then thought, hey, this is a clever joke, I'm going to mail in a photocopy of these keys, and it's almost like you have the key to knowing who mailed the card, and also he lived on a place called Keys Road in the past. These types of mental connections start to make sense for me. Which one sounds better to you? Which one makes more sense to you? Did Chester Clark Klingle fabricate this, and he was not the Zodiac? Or that was Chester Clark Klingle the Zodiac Killer? Or do you go into the third category? Maybe he lost the keys, somebody picked them up, photocopied them, and they just sent this in as a pure red herring. Now, even though this isn't my go-to theory, I will provide one piece of supporting evidence for the third option, that somebody just mailed these in. Why would somebody let another person take the fall for it? Why would somebody else want somebody to take credit for their criminal achievements? Because I do think that the narcissistic individual who would be mailing these taunts thought of these as achievements. And that would be that if they weren't actually guilty, they wouldn't be convicted. It's just trolling the police. It's just trolling the authorities. It's just confusing people. So we have three real possibilities. Now, at this time, I would also like to ask you guys the challenge question. What do you make of the Tarbox confession? Do you think that Robert Tarbox actually talked to Chester Klingle? He said that a merchant marine came into his office, which we can only accept was a white Caucasian male, and that he confessed to have been the Zodiac Killer, paid $50, and he was never seen or heard from again in Tarbox's office. Now, Chester Clark Klingle joined the Merchant Marines when he was 15 years old, and he would have been 43 years old after the Zodiac Killer identified himself, or after he publicly used the name Zodiac. So, isn't that an enormous time frame? And Chester Clark Klingle's also been in the Army at that point, and he's not exactly only devoted to the Merchant Marines throughout the entirety of his life, so that is also somewhat questionable, only looking at the facts. He was in the Merchant Marines decades before that. Why would he just pull that out of his memory when there were so many other things that had happened more recently? So I have some doubts about Chester Klingle being the person who was in Tarbox's office. And let's also make a strong point. Just because person A was a Merchant Marine and person B was a Merchant Marine does not mean that they were the same person, right? So that's another point. And now I'm finally going to get to the conclusion, because this is some important stuff, and it's also very sad and tragic. Chester Clark Klingle was Chester Clark Klingle Jr., also Chester Clark Klingle II. His son was named Chester Clark Klingle III. His son passed away in 1986 because of an accident. And, Graysmith's book also came out in 1986. This is pure conjecture on my part. We have Graysmith releasing the Zodiac book in 86, revitalizing the story. We have Gareth Penn putting out Time 17 in 1987. Then the Eureka card comes in 1990. Now, could somebody like Chester Clark Klingle have lost his son tragically in 1986 and been deeply affected by that? And was this a time when certain things began to affect his personality, behavior, judgment, and choices in a very negative way? And maybe something he did to distract himself would be exploring the Zodiac Killer mystery. Yes, Graysmith's book, yes, Time 17, but also trying to find out more from old newspapers, old magazines that had been written about the killer. And did he develop some type of obsession with this particular story, and he chose to fabricate the Eureka card because of mental distress? And I don't even mean to say that this would be done as some type of pure coping mechanism, maybe an indirect coping mechanism, and that's guesswork on my part. Because I'm not a mind reader, I'm not a psychic, I'm not a clairvoyant, I'm not a medium, but I do notice that these things do line up, where he has this personal tragedy around the same time that the book comes out, and this could be something that was a very big distraction for him. And let's not kid ourselves, most of you who are listening to this episode right now have also gone down the Zodiac Killer rabbit hole. Right, and it's turned into somewhat of an obsession for you, would you say that? Well, was Chester Clark Klingle one of the first people to do this? And no matter what, he just couldn't resist inserting himself into the story. And he couldn't resist creating the Eureka card, or even just adding in modifications to the Eureka card, also with photocopying his own keys, because he didn't really think that anybody was going to trace it back to him. And he would have been right for about 17 years, because, as we said, this was like kind of just archived and filed away. But could he have just done that because he wanted to have that type of experience? And one thing that I have noticed more and more frequently and more frequently, is that people will put things into motion. I mean, like, you can see this with serial killers, you can see this with hoaxers, with pranksters, and with people who are just telling lies. Sometimes they are doing it because they want to have the power. It's like a type of power tripping mechanism. I know the truth and you don't, therefore I am in control of all things, so to speak. That's one thing. And then the second thing would be that they're also trying to do this just because they followed a mystery, and they want to create a false lead in the mystery simply to just see what happens. That's really what it is. It's almost just like using people as a domino effect, and it's bad. That's unethical. If anybody were to create a type of hoax or fabrication for any type of true crime case and try to deceive people and make them think that it's real, that's bad. I mean, then that's not true crime. That is somebody who is playing games. And it all comes back to that whole concept of just using people as objects to entertain oneself with, even if it's done in some type of sick and twisted way where they're pretending to be a murderer. I would really hope that I'm wrong. I mean that. I hope that I'm wrong. That Chester Clark Klingle didn't do this because he developed some type of obsession with the Zodiac Killer, and he wanted to fabricate a card because he wanted to be involved with the process, to have that type of experience. I really would like to be wrong, but as I said, I'm about 95% certain that Chester Clark Klingle fabricated the Eureka card, but I do not think that he was the Zodiac Killer. And some of the reasons for that I haven't talked about too much, but they would be that, number one, they talk about stuff about being investigated, fingerprints and DNA and so on. We aren't even sure if we have the Zodiac Killer's DNA. The fingerprint evidence is now questionable in the Zodiac Killer mystery. Lots of partials and fragments. So I'm also not even overly convinced if there's any way to get some type of forensic certainty. But I would love to know what you guys think. Please weigh in about Chester Clark Klingle. And on Thursdays in the past, I used to do the segment True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning. And that was just a general true crime discussion show. And on that episode, I would frequently begin with a segment called the Crime Talk Points, because I'm a daily and regular listener to the show Crime Talk, which is hosted by Scott Reich. And he made a statement that I would love your responses to. Normally, hosts of programs begin with an unrelated challenge question. With this episode, I'm going to conclude with an unrelated challenge question, and that is, does the cream of the crop rise to the top? What does that mean? Does the cream of the crop rise to the top? On his program, he said the cream of the crop rises to the top, meaning if somebody is actually good at something, then they will move to the highest level of a particular group. And, he's someone who airs a show on YouTube, and I really began to think about that, and I was like, no, on YouTube, that doesn't happen. I really don't think that happens. And it has nothing to do with Black Box Online Radio. It's that when I am watching true crime YouTubers, sometimes I can find a brilliant channel, an excellent and well-made channel that has well-produced videos, and I even found this one where somebody was in front of the camera, and she had what looked like a professional studio, and she was reading a script, but it didn't sound like she was reading a script because the way that she was doing it was very fluid. And I even asked her in the comment section, hey, were you reading, or were you just like reciting all of those things from memory? And she says, oh yeah, I'm reading with a prompter. It looked amazing, it sounded amazing. She's getting 200 views per episode. And then I've also seen shows from other types of genres, like from psychology, where again, very well produced content, very well narrated content, very well edited content. Those people are also getting less than 2,000 views per episode. And when they actually have substance, and they actually have things that are either credible or on par with some of the more famous channels out there, It's really not about the cream of the crop. It's almost about people who might understand certain things about how and to make something more popular. Now, if that counts as rising to the top, then okay, sure. But that's not about the quality of their discussions and the quality of their information and the quality of the episodes that they are creating. So another example of this would be that you guys must have experienced this, whether you follow the Zodiac Killer mystery or some other type of mystery, and you'll be watching some type of famous high-end YouTuber, one of the most famous true crime YouTubers out there that might have 700,000 subscribers or something, and they'll be doing a true crime episode, and 75% of their facts will be incorrect, or they'll just be slightly off by something, and they'll just be making mistakes nonstop, and then they're trying to make things sound more mysterious than they actually are, and they're just misrepresenting the stories, or the host obviously doesn't have a very strong command of the facts, and they can't separate, oh, no, this was something that was published in a newspaper article, but it turned out that that was incorrect information, and that's since been revealed to have been a giant mistake. They will just not really have that type of awareness. So does the cream of the crop rise to the top? I don't think so. I don't think that that's an all-encompassing statement. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. A lot of people rise to the top because of luck. And somebody was talking about this on Radio Reddit. When I was doing the True Crime Talk Radio in the morning segment, I would often include the Radio Reddit points after the True Crime Talk Radio points, or after the Crime Talk points, I would do the Radio Reddit segment. And what somebody said was, working in the music industry has told him one thing, and he learned one lesson. Succeeding in the music industry is often based on luck. Have you ever gone to a community theater and you just heard an absolutely amazing performer that just had this brilliant singing voice, and not only someone who just has some, natural talent and they are in a play, but this is clearly somebody who knows what they're doing. They're most likely some type of trained vocalist. They're an amazing singer. They can also perform very well. That person isn't immediately going to be famous. The same would be true of guitarists. The same would be true of keyboard players. No matter what genre or what experience you would have in the musical world, somebody doesn't just rise to the top because they have good musical abilities. The second point is that they would have to look a certain way, they would have to impress executives in a certain way, and also there's so many people out there who are musicians that they have to be noticed in the first place. So what that person said was that he learned from working in the music industry that the artists, like the recording artists that truly succeed and make it big, are mostly relying on luck. It's just that's what happened. They were noticed at the right time. They had the look that somebody wanted at the exact time, and it all just fell together. Because I guess not everyone is going to be a star. But I would love to know what your responses are to anything that has been discussed in this episode. What do you think about Chester Klingle as a Zodiac suspect? Overall, I can see why people would suspect him. I can see why people would suspect him outside of the Eureka card. I mean, he does seem like somebody who would have had personal connections to Northern California. He had a military background. He resembles the composite sketch to a certain degree. He resembles the colorized composite very well. He is also somebody who definitely seems like he would have had just all types of interlocking connections around the state. You heard all that stuff about just moving around in this place and that, and he owns the property near where Kathleen Johns was driving. So someone who's going to be extremely familiar with the back roads, who's going to have very clear exit strategies away from all the places. I mean, I understand all of that, but I'm still just not convinced that he was the Zodiac Killer, because we could compose very similar narratives about other suspects. Well, that's all for me now. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Black Box Online Radio, and I will be with you guys again on Monday, where I'll be discussing a new set of ideas about the Zodiac Killer, and I'll be playing the final interview segment with Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. And also, tomorrow is Friday, Cooper Friday, here on Black Box Online Radio. You can join me for a new episode about D.B. Cooper. And one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these discussions. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday here on Black Box Online Radio, and the shorts and reels come out on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. On YouTube, they're shorts, but I guess on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, they're called Reels, and they mostly talk about serial killers and true crime news. And there really are some major stories that are being discussed there, because when I'm looking at these stories of shorts and reels, I can really see the differences among the serial killers. For example, I did one recently, yesterday actually, talking about the Stoneman killer. And he was one that operated in India. And it goes into the category of what I call a serial killer legend, where we aren't even necessarily sure if it's one single serial killer. Somebody was just using a rock or a piece of concrete, like a concrete slab, to murder homeless men, homeless people. There were around 13 murders in Calcutta, 13 murders in Mumbai, maybe more in other cities. And it appears that the murder stopped in 1989 but resurfaced in 2009. So that might even suggest that somebody might have been in jail for 20 years, but we just don't know. But when you think about that, somebody who is murdering people, striking them with a rock, just beating them over the head, and then walking away, that person wants to commit murder, and they don't care what happens. They're not making any effort to conceal the body, and they're also not making any effort to act like the spotlight needs to be on them. When you look at the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s, yeah, he commits murders and he drives away, but he's all about everybody look at me, everybody focus on me. He may have murdered only 5 people, and as of now I do believe that. The Zodiac Killer only murdered 5 people, whereas somebody like the Stoneman, he was murdering dozens of people, and he doesn't want everybody to look at him. He wants to commit murder, and then he just doesn't care. He just doesn't care about anything. He's just operating in the shadows, and he is way more dangerous than the Zodiac Killer, in my opinion, because that is somebody who isn't trying to do this in a type of narcissistic, all eyes on me, just trying to commit the murders as what Jared Kobeck called the essential spark to get noticed. Someone like the Stoneman is just trying to commit murder because he has the desire and urge to kill, or maybe he has a specific type of rage that he is trying to deal with by committing murders. Terrible, terrible, no justification at all. But ultimately, the Stoneman was also never identified, so there are just a lot of murderous scumbags in the world. But in the true crime world, we aren't afraid to explore these subjects. Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and thank you also for listening to all of those rants at the end. And you can hear more about these things in the shorts that come out Monday through Friday here on YouTube. And you guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com, blackboxned88 on TikTok and Instagram. And that's all for me. Goodbye.